This is me. It's me the day I started kindergarten at Walter Miller Elementary School in Levittown, Pennsylvania. Like the enormous bow in my hair? Actually, forget the bow. It's the dress I mean to draw your attention to. That dress came from Switzerland, and I'm quite certain was unique among little girls starting school that year in Levittown. The way I came to have possession of that dress is that my father was an electrical engineer, and while I was busy starting school, he was in Geneva at an Atoms for Peace conference. My mother traveled with him, and they sent me that dress. On this particular morning, it was my grandmother who put that dress on me, tied that very large bow in my hair, and walked me to school. Now, what you need to know about my grandmother is that she had a very thick Yiddish accent. And what you need to know about me is that I had a severe articulation disorder. Well, this first day of school remained stuck in my memory because of my attempts to tell my teacher about that dress. To this day, I can close my eyes and see the expression on her face. It was one of kindness laced with utter panic. Panic arising, I'm sure, because she didn't understand a single word I was saying. Well, it would be several weeks later, when my parents returned from Europe, before we learned that the teacher put one and one together, the dress, the grandmother, and the odd articulation, and concluded that I was speaking a language that wasn't English. And I'd like to tell you that that was my one and only experience failing to make myself understood, but in fact it was an experience that would repeat itself many times over the next few years. So I'm sure I brought the sum of all those experiences with me when I went to see this movie. It was The Miracle Worker, and the movie tells the story of the first few weeks that Helen Keller spent with the woman who would become her longtime teacher, Annie Sullivan. It specifically depicts how Annie Sullivan brought to Helen Keller the very essence of language. Well, what a power. What a power to be able to bring language to a child who was previously unable to communicate. When I saw that movie, I knew I wanted that power. That's when I decided to become a teacher of the deaf and help deaf children learn spoken language. Now, why specifically spoken language, you might ask, when sign language provides a perfectly effective means of bridging the communication barrier that deaf children face? Well, it was Helen Keller herself who once said that of her two sensory deficits, deafness imposes the greater burden because blindness separates us from things, but deafness separates us from people. So if deaf children could learn spoken language, I reasoned, it would lessen that separation just that much more. It would broaden the circle of people they could communicate with. And my interest in spoken language has been maintained over the years by the simple fact that really all childhood communication disorders have their roots in spoken language. So even a problem like dyslexia, that on the surface appears to be a problem of only written language, can be shown to have its roots in spoken language. So again, my own interest has always been in spoken language or in speech. So now, let's look at speech. Speech is this extraordinary, special code. It's special because it's comprised of a small set of small elements that on their own are meaningless, but they can be combined to create larger, meaningful units. The small elements I'm talking about are known as phonemes. These are the consonants and vowels of a language. And phonemes can be combined to create words, and words can be combined to create sentences. For most of us, our awareness of phonemes in the speech that we hear is so strong that it's a reasonable assumption to believe that they must be represented in the physical structure. Speaking of speech, is my speech corrected now? Anyway, it's a reasonable assumption to believe that phonemes must be represented in the physical structure, the acoustic signal of speech, in the manner I've depicted here, as discrete elements lined up through time. And it was on that assumption that the very first technological efforts involving speech were launched. In particular, efforts were undertaken to build machines that could understand human speech. Should be a simple enough task, right? Just a case of acoustic pattern recognition. Well, let me tell you, in spite of decades of work by some very bright people, we have yet to realize our original objectives of machine recognition of speech. It remains kludgy. It's sometimes described as brittle, meaning it works, but it breaks easily. Of course, I probably don't need to tell all of you that. How many of you have this kind of relationship with your smartphone? Now, the reason this has proven to be such a daunting task is that the picture I showed you a minute ago is categorically wrong. Here's a picture of speech. It's a spectrogram. It has time on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis. Those wavy black bars you see snaking their way through the spectrogram are known as formants. They're the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract. There are 2 points to be made with the spectrogram. The first is that you cannot segment it into discrete elements. That is, you cannot draw lines perpendicular to the time axis, marking where one phoneme ends and the next begins. The second point is that even if one is tempted to say, okay, that's fine, but it is possible to identify a narrow slice that aligns with one and only one phoneme, what you quickly discover is that the acoustic structure of that slice varies, depending on who's doing the talking and what phonemes came before and what phonemes came after. Now, these two problems have been known for a very long time. For darn near as long as efforts have been ongoing to build machines to recognize human speech. Nonetheless, we have continued to look to the acoustic signal for solutions to the challenges we face. We have used our advancing technology to carve the acoustic signal up into increasingly small chunks known as cues. And then we've developed mathematical models for how those cues must combine in order to specify each phoneme. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression today that those efforts have not been important. They've been very important. Anytime you're working on a problem, it's necessary to understand the stuff that you're working with. But they have not been sufficient. They have not been sufficient to give us reliable machine recognition of speech, nor have they been sufficient to give us treatment strategies to solve human communication disorders. Something more is needed. And I propose that we can find clues as to what that something more is by looking at another technological advance. And that is the cochlear implant, as shown here on this little boy. The cochlear implant has two parts. It has an internal component that's placed in the cochlea, or the inner ear. It directly stimulates the auditory nerve, thus bypassing the damaged transducer cells. It's anchored in place by a magnet that's placed here behind the outer ear. The external component, which I have here, attaches to it by another magnet. The external component takes sound in, it processes that sound, and then it sends the processed sound to the internal component across the magnets. In contrast to our efforts to build machines that recognize human speech, the cochlear implant has been overwhelmingly successful. Where deaf children are concerned, it has, for the first time ever, placed spoken language truly within their reach. Let me show you. Here are some children I taught in the days before cochlear implants were available. As you can see, they were on their way to PE. They're flexing their muscles there for the camera. And this is what they sounded like. Now let's fast forward 35 years, and I'm going to play another speech sample for you. This one from a little girl who was born deaf and got a cochlear implant at 1 year of age.
So how do you play Duck, Duck, Goose? I don't remember that one.
It's just regular duck, 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 goose.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to play, though.
You're not supposed to have just one or a few kids, like 3.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to, you can.
I think you'd agree with me that that's a remarkable difference. And that difference is rendered all the more remarkable when you realize that that little girl managed to do that with a degraded signal. Here's another spectrogram. And this is the sentence that spectrogram was made from.
Knees talk with mice.
You can see the detail in the signal there. But now watch what happens to that detail when this sentence is processed the way that a cochlear implant processes speech. As you can see, it's largely eliminated. And this is what that signal sounds like.
Knees talk with mice.
So now, how is that possible? How is it possible that that little girl managed to learn to understand and produce speech as well as she did in a few short years when she was a baby with only a degraded signal available to her, when the best scientists and engineers in the world, after decades of work using clear, highly detailed signals, have been unable to build machines that perform comparably? Well, the answer to that riddle is surely that she had a secret weapon. She had a human perceptual system, a system bestowed upon her by simple genetics, just by the fact that she is human. As it turns out, we are not passive recipients of the sensory information reaching us. We act upon it. And one thing that we do is known as perceptual organization. And that's best demonstrated using visual examples. So here's a simple line drawing. And when you look at it, the same sensory information is reaching your visual system consistently. But depending on how you organize it, you can recover either the form of a young woman looking over her shoulder or of an older woman with her chin in her chest. Here's another example. Just squares of various shades of gray. Yet many of us are able to organize those gray squares in order to recover the form of one of our dead presidents. So now these visual examples demonstrate the effect, but returning to acoustic signals, it's clear that this phenomenon of perceptual organization can explain how it is that we're able to recover phonemes from the acoustic speech signal when they're not represented there in a transparent manner. We know how to organize those signals, machines do not. Nonetheless, notice that it was necessary for me to use degraded signals in order to illustrate this effect. If I had used clear, highly detailed visual images, everybody would have been able to recover the intended form quite easily. It's only when the task is made difficult by using degraded or ambiguous signals that it becomes available to conscious inspection. And now also recall that I showed you a minute ago that cochlear implants provide only degraded signals to its users. So with those points in mind, let's look at some actual data. These data come from 8-year-old children. The task was simply to listen to words and say what you heard. The circles on your left show that all children with normal hearing were able to perform this task quite well. The squares on your right show there was more variability among children with cochlear implants. Now, all those squares came from children who were born within a year of each other. They all got cochlear implants at a young age. They all got the same cochlear implants. And they all had more or less the same early intervention. Yet look at that spread of scores. I believe that variability is explained by individual differences in how well those children could organize the signals they get through their implants. A primary focus of work in my lab is on trying to uncover the bases of those individual differences and on trying to discover effective treatments to help all deaf children learn how to organize the signals they get through their implants. And in that way, I hope we can move all of those squares to the top of the chart. Another focus of work in my laboratory also hinges on this idea of individual differences. Although it's necessary for us to use degraded signals to demonstrate this effect to ourselves, what if it's the case that there are some people, some children, who are so poor at this thing that even when they get clear, highly detailed signals, they sometimes get it wrong? And what if that problem can explain childhood communication disorders? Well, to examine that possibility, it again is necessary to use degraded signals. That's so that we can quantify the effect. So in this experiment, we presented sentences processed the way that cochlear implants process speech. I played a sample for you a minute ago. And we presented these sentences to children with dyslexia and children learning to read in typical fashion. As you can see, the children with dyslexia have more trouble recognizing words in those sentences than the typical readers. And even though we measured the effect using degraded signals, it seems likely that these children with dyslexia had so much difficulty with this that even when they hear clear speech, they have problems organizing those signals in order to recover the form of phonemes. Okay, so let me just take a minute here to drive home my main points. We've been talking about a number of challenges that we face, all involving communication. The challenge of trying to help children who are having difficulty being understood. The challenges of deaf children trying to understand speech through their cochlear implants. The struggles of some children with normal hearing in trying to learn to read and to write. And the challenges we faced in trying to build machines that reliably recognize human speech. I've proposed that progress on all of these fronts could be facilitated if we better understood what it is that the human perceiver is doing. And that's what gets me out of bed every morning. To be sure, a lot of great research has been done on this topic, but more is needed. Only when we have a thorough account of what it is that the human perceiver is doing will we be able to develop completely effective treatments for dealing with human communication disorders. Then I believe we'll also be able to write those processes into software so that we can build machines that reliably recognize all of human speech. Thank you.